Shirley, how do you apply critical pedagogy to your own work? How has it informed your research and your practice?
Well, in every way. And even before I knew about it, I was doing it. And so when David Smith, my professor in my master's program, introduced me to it, there was that moment where I realized, there is a connection and there is a voice to what I'm doing. And I was originally a lot of things, but when I first became a teacher, professional teacher, I worked in literacy, but then very quickly got into theater. And I was a drama teacher, which made me a drama director. And I realized working in the arts that the curriculum can't fit into the arts the way that people make it squeeze into other things. And so I started to have to redesign how I would teach theater and direct things and use a critical pedagogical sense. And one of the first ways I did it was when I was forced to teach Shakespeare, which I know you love Shakespeare. I don't. And in grade 10 in Canada, you have to teach Romeo and Juliet, my least favorite play. I just wanted to make it in the 80s a more important play than it usually was. And I just started to read and hear about this thing called rap. And my students were, of course, very aware of it. And I worked with them, and we decided that they would interpret all of Romeo and Juliet through rap. Mm-hmm. And it became so exciting that it just blew up. And somebody called the newspaper, and there was a big article on it, and it was amazing, and everyone learned, and the kids will never forget it. And the teachers in my school hated me for it, and they hated what the students were doing. So it was a very quick way to understand that many times when you do edgy, emancipatory work with a kids like and learn from, it's not going to be approved or enjoyed by your colleagues because we're not punishing the kids. We're actually engaging them. And so I realized at a very young part of my career that engagement was my number one thing. Mm. It's not the standards, it's not the curriculum, engagement. And that is number one to this day. The most important thing to me is to engage. And I became, when I did my doctorate, after about a year or two of realizing I can't deal with a public school system, I know I'll become an academic, I can sleep later in the morning, and I can be left alone. And I pretty well have been in a lot of ways. Being a writer and a teacher has allowed me to maybe be where I can be and make a difference in schools where maybe at the school level I just was a bit much. Mm. And by doing that, when I started my doctorate, I decided to do it in film and in how film had affected youth. And every single methodology didn't work. It just didn't work. It was all, you have to do this, you have to do that, and I wanted to do more. And so I started to remember David Smith's class and where he went through every modem, every kind of critical qualitative research that was affected by critical pedagogy. So there was a whole handful. And I said to Kincheloe, I said, what if I did all my research and then read it through every single lens that Smith taught me instead of one lens, instead of a methodology that was autobiographical or narrative research or hermeneutic? I want to do it all. And so that's actually how Kincheloe and I came about creating bricolage. And so even as an early doctoral student, I was still reminded and affected by how critical pedagogy helps us. And so everything I do is now really, it isn't not based in critical pedagogy. I just finished quite a long time working with a school in Glasgow in a community education department. And they use critical pedagogy as the theoretical framework for the entire community educational department. Now that's not pedagogy, but to them they've interpreted, yes, community work is about pedagogy, that pedagogy is practiced in and out of schools, that it's informal as well as formal. So everything I do is affected, and I love it.
No wonder we have so I love your work so much. I did the same task with my students in Shakespeare. They had to do a reinterpretation.
Really? Okay.
And they did rap. They could pick any multimodal genre, and some of them did do rap, but I'll show you if we've got time some of their responses.
I love that.
They were amazing.
It's an amazing.
Some of them did political satires and wrote
and that's great.
Yeah. And I also was a great fan of bricolage because I used that to wrap my study because I had the same experience as you. I just, certain frameworks would offer you something,
Right.
but not enough.
And since I've read your work and read your thesis and your book, you're right. You couldn't have said what you said without looking at different ways of seeing it.
Yeah, which brings us to now we're in 2018. Some people say critical pedagogy's had its day. It's still trapped in an 80s suit. Where to for critical pedagogy, and how does it speak back with the post-qual turn and the post-humanist turn, which is anchored in realism? So how does it speak back to where the emerging trends or sexy paradigms?
Good and annoying questions. I'll hit the annoyings first. I won't even address the post anything. I am so over post toasty. I am over it. I'm over post truth. I'm over post qual. It becomes the point where the exercise in academic trivia becomes so important that we forget about the work we're doing. So I'm going to just stick in regular critical qualitative research and ways of seeing the world. So I'm done with that, okay? As far as yeah, it is an 80s genre because it sort of came around in the 80s. But at that time, we had very interesting, very young scholars. And there was kind of a rock and roll aspect to them. And a lot of them still, I think they're rock and roll. But, and it was white. It was incredibly white. And it was very male. It wasn't male because it was insisted upon. It's people that were drew to this reading were drawn to it. And it's just how it happened. If maybe 25 Latina women had, in the United States, read it first, maybe it would have been a Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican movement of women. But it wasn't. It was white man. And I'm not going to fault them for that. Just like I'm not going to fault Paulo for using language which was masculine because he spoke Portuguese. But what it says is still as important or more important now than it was then. It needs to be refurbished in that it needs to be introduced and worked with alternative communities other than the mainstream white and often male people that have often, brought it in. And it certainly is now. I mean, I'm thinking of the work done by Yoli Ruiz, by Mariana Soto Manning, women that are just phenomenal. I'm looking at LGBT scholars. I'm looking at Asian scholars. I'm looking at people from all over the world doing critical pedagogy. And what's interesting is they really are doing it. They all know. They know more in schools in most countries of the world of what Paulo Freire did than they do in North America. And so that's telling me that it has moved. So when your question's asked, it's really about, to me, English-speaking countries, because it's being done very well. There are over 400 schools now all over Spain and the world that have been created by a very small Freirean group in the 1970s where Paulo actually worked with them. So we have this being done. So what can we do in English-speaking schools? Well, we have to fight against the machine in a lot of ways. We have to show administrators and change makers that curriculum is dying and that kids are dropping out of school and that boys especially are not making it through and that people are frustrated. We have to teach not to go to university as our only goal. We have to have kids to have an alternative, to understand, to bring back vocational education. We have to be able to bring in alternative voices, and certainly the indigenous movements in our countries are making attempts to do that, but also in those movements we have to have indigenous people at the top of the deciding groups, and that becomes important. We have to elect people in our countries that are going to speak for education. I hear nothing out of the 5 English-speaking countries, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and the United States, that really is significant about education. I don't from their policymakers and their prime ministers and presidents. I'm not hearing that education important. So we have to really become citizens. We have to become absolutely authentically engaged in community work and start from there. So I think the way to make it revived, and I don't feel like it's a dead thing. I think people who are 60 and 70 and never got onto the boat probably say it's a dead thing because they're just tired of people talking about it. But I think what's happening now in a generation full of activists and full of angry young people who are just tired of the status quo, I think it's got a tremendous chance.
Thank you very much. A lovely note to finish on. Thanks, Shirley.